warm welcome to episode 3 of the second season of the Realise Mindfulness podcast. This season our theme is mindful compassion, and together we'll explore some of the core themes and practices from one of the leading mindful compassion courses, Mindfulness-Based Compassionate Living. In our episode today, we focus on self-compassion in more detail and talk about the phenomenon of backdraft. That's the different ways we sometimes encounter resistance as we begin to practice compassion. And of course, as we do in every episode, we'll share a short on-the-go mindful compassion practice. That's one that you can use anytime, anywhere. And we'll end with a longer guided practice, which today will be a compassionate companion practice. A short disclaimer at this point. The Mindfulness-Based Compassionate Living course, which we'll call MBCL for short, was developed to support deepening your mindfulness practice, and it assumes that you've already spent some time building mindful foundations. So if you're new to mindfulness, you may find it helpful to start by listening to Season 1. And if you're ready to explore mindful compassion together, let me acknowledge that the MBCL course is rich and deep, and this podcast is in no way a replacement for attending an 8-week course. Rather, it is intended as either an introduction, a companion, or maybe a refresher for the course. And if you're interested in finding out more, I've included some helpful links in the show notes. So, without further ado, let's begin today's episode as we explore self-compassion. And let's begin with a question. So, maybe taking a mindful pause, grounding in your body by maybe feeling a sense of your feet on the floor, your posture, however you're sitting or standing right now, and taking a few conscious breaths, following the flow of the breath all the way in and all the way out. And considering for a moment, what do you think stops us from practicing mindful self-compassion? And just noticing what responses come up for you. Common resistances to practicing self-compassion can be a worry that it might be self-indulgent or even selfish. Another common concern is that without our inner critic driving us on, perhaps our standards may slip. And we may also worry that if we become more compassionate to others, it could include condoning poor behaviour, or even becoming overwhelmed by the cares and concerns in the world. Let's take a look at each of these points in more detail. In fact, a growing body of research shows that the opposite is true. One challenge is that when we talk about self-compassion, we sometimes confuse it with self-esteem. Whereas self-esteem can risk leading to a sense of self-importance and even self-centeredness, perhaps building ourselves up to the detriment of others, or conversely being dependent on the opinions of others or external accolades like grades and promotions to fuel our self-worth. Self-compassion, on the other hand, is about being on our own side, being with ourselves through the ups and downs of life, celebrating our successes and learning with kindness from our failures, treating ourselves like we would a good friend. In relation to our inner critic, research has shown that treating ourselves with kindness and encouragement is actually much more effective and more motivating than speaking harshly to ourselves. For instance, dieters who were offered a self-compassion intervention fared better with their healthy eating intentions than colleagues who simply focused on healthy eating guidelines and willpower alone. I can appreciate this personally. For much of my teens and early 20s, I was a classic yo-yo dieter. Sometimes it seemed like my self-worth was tied to what the scales said and how well I was sticking to the rules of the latest diet. Inevitably, I'd eventually break the rules of the latest eating plan, and then I'd fall into a morass of self-recrimination and beating myself up. It turns out that shame and guilt are terrible motivators. When I was able to bring an attitude of kindness and compassion to my eating habits and body image, things slowly began to shift, and my eating habits and my weight stabilised. For many of us, myself included, this is an ongoing journey of learning to relate kindly to ourselves and to our habits and patterns. We'll explore this in more detail in our next episode. Coming back now to our concerns about self-compassion and that maybe it could make us selfish, actually the reverse seems to be true. People who score more highly on self-compassion have also been shown to be more likely to take responsibility for their mistakes and to demonstrate more empathy, forgiveness, and altruism. Compassion is also linked to resilience and to healthier ways to cope with the adverse conditions we all face in life. All in all, we could say that rather than making us selfish, weak, or overwhelmed, compassion, in all its different flavours, can help us to care more effectively for the whole of the ecosystem, rather than just the ecosystem of I, me, and mine. So, now we have a sense of why self-compassion is so beneficial. Let's look at how we can nurture it as a route to overcoming some of our instinctive human reactions to threat and to stress. Kristen Neff, leading self-compassion researcher and co-developer of the Mindful Self-Compassion Program, has developed a wonderful 3-point definition of the components of self-compassion. She points us to the fact that it involves 3 factors: mindful awareness, common humanity, and self-kindness. We can get an embodied sense of this through some simple movements. If you're in a place where it feels safe and comfortable for you to do so, you may like to join me in exploring these gestures. First, turn your palms up and open your arms, not too high and not too wide, almost as if you're holding a large tray in front of you. Relax your body and breathe out. How does this feel? Often people say things like open and receptive. This posture represents mindfulness. Next, imagine you're giving someone a hug, someone standing in front of you. Feel into the posture now. How does this feel? Often people offer things like warm, accepting, connected. This posture embodies a stance of common humanity. Finally, shaking that stance out and coming to stand or sit still, you're invited to bring both hands to your heart, one hand resting on top of the other. How does this feel? Common responses include tenderness and care. And just to acknowledge that for some of us this can also feel quite strange or even uncomfortable. We'll talk about this a bit more later when we explore backdraft. So coming back to this sense of hands resting on the heart. And contrast that with the way many of us go through our day, often tense and clenched as we dodge from fielding one challenge to the next. Most of us are familiar with the idea of fight, flight and freeze, and the way we instinctively respond to threat and to stress. The interesting thing about this is that our body can respond in the same way whether the threat's real or whether it's imagined, and whether the stress is internal or external. For example, self-criticism can have just as big an impact as criticism from a friend or a colleague. We'll come back to the power of our imagination later. But for now, an invitation to explore the postures of fight, flight and freeze, and how mindful self-compassion can help us counteract some of the ways we internalise these stress reactions. For some of us, the fight posture can feel very familiar. Maybe try it out now, clenching your fists, maybe bringing your arms in front of you in guard posture. This may feel like a strong posture, but I'm guessing you also feel tension and constriction in your body. When I do this exercise with clients, many observe that it would be quite exhausting to hold this posture for a long time, and yet for many of us, this is how we're travelling through our day, on high alert, tense to react to the next incoming demand. For others of us, the flight response is more instinctive. Imagine now how it feels in your body to be running from something. Again, maybe it's exhilarating in the short term, but perhaps tiring if we're facing a marathon. Finally, the freeze response can be common to some of us, particularly if we've experienced trauma. Here we may feel stuck. Imagine wading through sticky treacle. Or disassociated, not really in our body or with our current experience. When we turn our fight response inwards, we're often bombarding ourselves with self-criticism, telling ourselves we should be doing better, be a better person. As we've already explored, this is counterproductive. In the long term, criticism is a poor motivator. Here, the antidote is self-kindness. Remember that gesture of bringing our hands to our heart. Maybe try it now. Self-isolation can be the impact of turning the flight response inwards. We may find ourselves disconnecting from those around us, cutting ourselves off from potential connection because of fear, anxiety and distrust. Here, common humanity is the antidote. Remember that compassionate gesture of giving a hug. We can find ourselves stuck in over-identification, locked in our own opinions and narrow perceptions if we internalise the freeze response too much. Here, the antidote is mindfulness. Remember that sense of open-handed receptivity? There's another instinctual response to threat that we all know and utilise, but that's less commonly talked about. And that's our instinct to tend and befriend. Most mammals have this instinctive urge to care for and nurture the young, and even protect and care for the sick. In this way, essential bonds of community are maintained. But when this tendency goes into overdrive, humans can become over-involved or controlling. Think of the classic helicopter parent who may smother their child's natural interests. Conversely, we can become burnt out by self-sacrifice if we continually put others' needs above our own. Think of the martyr archetype here. The old adage of putting on our own oxygen mask first holds true in this scenario. Either way, it's helpful to be mindfully aware, expanding our view and inviting a healthy shift from focusing on my needs or your needs to our needs. The African philosophy of Ubuntu springs to mind. I am because we are. When we view the world through the lens of mindful self-compassion, we can begin to notice our experience and patterns of behaviour without judgment. We can recognise the shared humanity of our instinctive reactions, and we can begin to be kind to ourselves in the midst of challenge and difficulty. Kristin Neff and Chris Germer, creators of the Mindful Self-Compassion programme, have developed a beautiful short mindfulness practice around this, and it can be particularly helpful in moments of challenge or difficulty. They call it the self-compassion break, and this will be our on-the-go practice for this episode. It works like this. Imagine you've just sent an email and immediately you get a couple of replies pointing out a spelling mistake. You may guess I'm choosing this because I can personally relate. In my case, I may mindfully notice feelings of embarrassment, the hot cheeks, a desire to hide, a default response to turn my fight response inwards was self-criticism, berating myself for being so stupid and not noticing the mistake whilst I was proofreading. However, mindfulness creates a pause, a space in which I can choose to shift from my instinctive old brain reaction to a new mindful new brain response, and instead offer myself a self-compassion break. It has 3 stages or phrases. First, we acknowledge the moment of suffering, and then we acknowledge that suffering's a part of life. Finally, offering ourselves a kind wish. In the example of my email, it may sound like this. This is embarrassing. It's okay. It's human to make mistakes and get embarrassed. So may I be kind to myself right now. We can choose to tailor the self-compassion break to our particular circumstances, or we may prefer to use more general phrases such as, "This is a moment of suffering or difficulty." Suffering is a part of life, or maybe we all experience challenges. So may I be kind to myself right now. And supporting us to turn towards our moments of challenge in this way, with an attitude of allowing, kindness and compassion, mindful compassion can be present to the whole of our human experience, be it pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. The last theme I want to explore together before we share a longer practice is the concept of backdraft. This phrase was coined by psychologists Chris Germer and Kristin Neff. They recognised that just as when a fire's starved of oxygen and the flames lay dormant, but when the oxygen is suddenly reintroduced, for instance by opening a door in a burning building, the fire may burst back into flames, sometimes quite explosively. In the same way, if we've perhaps not experienced much kindness or compassion in our life from early caregivers, or from recent relationships, then introducing self-compassion can initially result in a backdraft-like reaction. It can almost be as if introducing compassion can trigger our threat response and a sense of panic. Recognising what's happening and knowing backdraft can be a common response can support us in mindfully focusing on our soothing system, maybe on a sense of grounding. using a soothing breathing rhythm, or some compassionate touch, maybe hands on heart. We may notice backdrafts showing up for us in different ways, depending on our own personal experience. Two further metaphors can help us understand some of our common human reactions and resistances to compassion. One of my good friends adopted a street dog from a rescue charity many years ago. This beautiful dog had been badly treated by humans and was initially and very understandably distrustful of them, even when they were trying to be kind. For the first few days she was happiest at the end of the garden, or even hiding under the table. When humans came near, she could bark or growl, telling them to keep their distance. Rather than rush her or force attention onto the new canine member of the family, my friend, who's a kind and wise animal whisperer, if you will, let the dog take things at her own pace. And slowly, in this way, a loving and trusting relationship was built. If we have a loud inner critic, or have been harshly criticised and treated by others in the past, we may, like the street dog in my story, initially respond to compassion with fear, mistrust, or even anger. The invitation here is to proceed slowly and gently, with patience, and if we feel overwhelmed, maybe seeking out the support of an experienced teacher. Another common response to introducing self-compassion can be sadness and grief. If kindness and compassion have been lacking in our lives, we may begin to feel an acute sense of loss and sadness for what's been missing. Likewise, if we have a strong inner critic, recognising how hard we are on ourselves and the impact this has, can also give rise to sorrow and regret. As I've mentioned, I work outside in nature a lot, and I care for horses. On very cold days, my hands and feet can get freezing. When I was younger, the temptation once I got home was to warm up as quickly as possible, putting my hands under a warm tap. Anyone who's done this will know the result. Maybe you're even getting a remembered sense of it as you listen. The initial relief of warmth rapidly gives way to prickles, pins and needles, and discomfort. So again, the message is to proceed slowly and with patience as we begin to offer ourselves kindness and compassion. It can be helpful to know that all these reactions are normal and human. They don't mean we're doing it wrong, but they may be a pointer to slow down, to focus on grounding and foundational practices such as body and breath awareness, resting in a supportive anchor place, and maybe seeking the support of a qualified teacher. If you're noticing yourself strongly affected by some of these backdraft phenomena, please feel free to reach out to me. You can contact me via my website and the links in the show notes. So, as usual, we'll close our episode with a longer guided meditation practice today. But before we do, let me offer a brief summary of what we've explored so far. We began by talking about some common blocks to self-compassion and looked at how the research addresses some of these common concerns. We practiced embodied gestures of self-compassion and talked about how self-compassion can act as an antidote to our common human tendencies, those of over-identification, self-isolation and self-criticism. We talked about our tend and befriend instinct and how mindful compassion encourages a mindset shift from me or you to we. And finally, we've explored the phenomenon of backdraft. To consolidate all we've covered today, I'll offer a compassionate companion meditation in a moment. This practice is usually shared on week 2 of the Mindfulness-Based Compassionate Living course, and it's a beautiful acknowledgement of the fact that So many of us can find it hard to be kind to ourselves. It's something we need to learn and practice like any skill. And it helps to learn with a kind teacher or supportive mentor. That's where our compassionate companion comes in. Before we begin, let me also say a quick word about how we use imagery in the MBCL course. In episode 2, we talked about how our brain evolved. These mindful compassion practices offer us ways of working with our old brain functions through the body, for instance, our soothing breathing rhythm. At the same time, we're working with our new brain functions through words and through imagination. As I mentioned earlier, our brain isn't always good at distinguishing between real and imagined situations. We can get a sense of this now. Imagine a lemon. Picture it now in front of you on a chopping board, noticing its vivid yellow colour, its waxy outer skin. Maybe even imagining how it would feel in your hands if you picked it up. And lifting it to your nose, how would it smell? Now imagine putting it back on the chopping board and slicing into it. What aromas are released? Maybe there's a squirt of juice. Maybe you can see the different colours and textures of the inside of the lemon. Now imagine cutting a slice and lifting it to your lips, taking a deep inhale before finally tasting the lemon. Okay, so what do you notice in your body right now? What's happening in your mouth? I bet your body's instinctively started to salivate. And depending on whether you like lemons or not, different thoughts, emotions and reactions will be cascading through your system. That's the power of our imagination. In this way, over time and with practice, we can build new neural pathways of kindness and compassion, both through our on-the-go short practices and through our longer formal meditation practices. So, I invite you to find a space where you won't be disturbed for the next 15 or 20 minutes, and choose a comfortable posture as we share our compassionate companion practice. This is a compassionate companion practice, and it will last for around 15 minutes. So deciding on a comfortable and supportive posture for the practice, whether that's sitting or lying. And as with all our compassion practices, we can begin with step 1 and step 2 of the breathing space with kindness. So beginning by arriving in mindfulness, really settling into and deepening into your chosen posture, perhaps tuning into a firm sense of body resting on the surface that's supporting you, feet resting on the floor, points of contact where the body's held and supported. And just noticing whatever's here, sensations, thoughts, moods, and as best you can, allowing space for it all, allowing your experience to be just as it is. And then turning the awareness to the breath, maybe beginning by noticing where the breath is most vivid for you today. just following the flow all the way in and all the way out. And in our compassion practices, rather than simply observing the flow of the breath just as it is, there can also be an invitation to adopt a soothing breathing rhythm. And maybe that involves deepening the breath, slowing it down a little, and really placing a focus on the exhale. So perhaps taking a deep breath in through the nose, and maybe even sighing out audibly through the mouth. Maybe doing that for a couple more breath cycles. And settling into a naturally soothing breathing rhythm. Allowing yourself to be gently rocked on the rhythm of your own breath. And knowing that at any time during our practice you can return to these two steps. A sense of mindful awareness of the body being held and supported by the surfaces it rests on, or a sense of the soothing breathing rhythm. And this can serve as a way to stabilize or anchor yourself in the practice. If at any time you start to feel a little bit lost, or maybe like you just need to return to home base. In this practice, we're going to invite the power of imagination to come out to play. So, not forcing anything and not needing anything to be any particular way. Maybe inviting a playful atmosphere and letting yourself be surprised by the free gift of your own imagination. And you'd maybe like to begin by bringing to mind an image of a safe place, in whatever way it might present itself now. So maybe the visual sense is quite clear, or maybe it's a felt sense of the atmosphere, sensations on the skin, sounds or aromas. And of course it could be a place in nature, or a place indoors, perhaps a familiar corner of your own home, or a place from your imagination. And allowing yourself to feel really welcomed and held by this place. Feeling at home and allowing the senses to bask in a sense of safeness. And from this safe place, allowing another image to emerge, opening yourself up to the presence of a compassionate being, a being who has your best interests at heart. And this compassionate companion may arise from memory, or from fantasy, or both. It may be a human being, or it may be an animal companion, a natural being, or a celestial being. And whatever being presents themselves, knowing that they're completely committed to your well-being, and they embody compassion in all its many qualities. A being who's kind and patient, sensitive, playful, and caring. A companion who's wise and understanding, having courage and resilience in the face of life's difficulties, and staying firmly on your side when you're suffering, accepting you just as you are, with all your imperfections and possibilities and humanness. And your compassionate companion wishes you well from the very depth of its heart, and is willing to relieve your suffering wherever it can. So exploring your compassionate companion through all your senses. What does your compassionate companion look like? What shape are they? What size? Big or small? Old or young? Male, female, or non-binary? Where in space are they positioned? In front? Beside? Behind? Above or below? And what distance? And knowing that the visual image may vary in clarity, various images may come and go. And for some of us the visual sense isn't our strongest sense, so maybe your companion appears more as a felt sense, or perhaps distinct sense perceptions, like how it might be to touch them or be next to them. Perhaps they have a clear aroma, or there's a certain sound, the sound of their voice, or a sound of being in their presence. And if this compassionate friend looked at you, what would their expression be like? What would you see around the eyes and the face? If they spoke to you, how would their voice sound? So an invitation to notice the effect that being in the presence of your compassionate companion has on you. Noticing what shows up in the body. Maybe there's a half smile appearing around the lips, or perhaps a sense of uplift or opening in the chest. A sense of settledness in the body. Or perhaps a sense of excitement and fizzing, or something else entirely. What's present in your body? And what thoughts are here as you bask in the presence of your compassionate companion? What moods are present? And allowing as best you can for all experiences. Remembering this is just a practice. There's no wrong or right way to be doing it. You maybe notice reactivity. Perhaps the practice is giving rise to a sense of sadness or longing. Acknowledging this can be part of the experience too. So being kind to yourself in whatever way supportive. Always returning to your home base of body on chair, feet on floor, soothing breath, if that's helpful. Or maybe offering yourself some soothing touch. Perhaps placing a hand on heart or belly, or just gently holding your own hands in your lap. As best you can, acknowledging and welcoming whatever shows up, pleasant, unpleasant, joyful, sad, tendencies to cling on to or to want to push things away. At any moment that's needed, just allowing that space for a mindful pause. Allowing yourself to return to the soothing breathing rhythm. And when you have space, if you choose to, returning to the imagery practice. Imagining this compassionate friend right beside you right now, relating to you in the very midst of this experience that you're having right now, offering you well wishes. And imagining this being really appreciating being in your presence. No matter how you are, your compassionate companion really welcomes you from the depths of their heart, acknowledges you. How does that make you feel? And knowing that you can continue with this practice for as long as you choose. And in a moment, the bell will sound to signal the end of our formal practice. But you can call upon your compassionate companion whenever you should choose, inviting them to support you and offer strength whenever you should need it. And for now, maybe getting ready to say goodbye to your compassionate companion, maybe expressing your gratitude to them, saying goodbye in your own way and letting a sense of their presence dissolve. Returning attention to a felt sense of body on the chair, feet on the floor. And slowly bringing our practice to a close. Thank you for joining us for today's episode. It's my heartfelt wish that this podcast, in its own small way, contributes to the spread of mindfulness and compassion in our world. If you like the podcast, please subscribe and follow it. And if you have friends who may be interested, please share it with them too. And if you'd like to find out more about me and my work, including the Mindfulness-Based Compassionate Living group course and one-to-one coaching, you can do so at my website, www.realisemindfulness.com. Please do keep listening, And if you'd like to keep in touch, it would be wonderful to hear from you. So, until next time, wishing you ease and kindness in the flow of life.